The first step is to understand that we can feel uncomfortable when we're faced with uncertainty, not because we're not getting the truth, but just because uncertainty is uncomfortable.
Hey, humans!
Welcome to Demystifying Science, the hottest spot in the galaxy for investigations of earthly affairs.
Today, we met up with Dr. L.A Paul, professor of philosophy at Yale University and author of the popular book Transformative Experience. Her work focuses on understanding how humans can rationally choose experiences that will fundamentally change who they are.
And the kinds of things, like having children, going to war, traveling to Mars, that will likely change the values that they hold most dear.
In Earth philosophy, this is actually called counterfactual analysis, the study of something that has not yet come to pass.
Our conversation considers how to think about unconventional forms of transformative experience, like pandemics, vaccines, and mask wearing. But we also took the time to investigate ideas like the relationship between science and philosophy,
Between rationality and morality,
the definition of truth.
and how to have a productive conversation with someone that you vehemently disagree with.
Dr. Paul suggested that it's a good idea to shift the starting point of the conversation. Find the common denominator, and then work your way forward, diagnosing where things fall apart as you go.
Overall, it was a really enlightening conversation. We really love Dr. Paul. She's an exceedingly curious human and is deeply concerned with framing investigations properly. Making sure to ask the correct questions to understand a given phenomena.
So sit back, relax, and enjoy the ride. Let us know in the comments section what you think. Give us a subscribe and share with your friends. Helps us keep the conversations queued up.
Yeah. See you next time, humans.
Bye!
Hello.
Hi,
You're an Earth philosopher.
I am.
That's amazing.
Are you alien philosophers? Are you some of my kind?
Well, it's weird on our planet. I was going to ask you about philosophy, but on our planet, scientists use philosophy. So we don't have philosophers.
Everyone's a philosopher.
How very Aristotelian. I like that picture.
It's like a toolkit philosophy on Alpha.
It's how we ask questions.
I think you guys sound pretty smart.
Is that how it works on Earth?
Sometimes, unfortunately, not always, in my view. I think sometimes philosophers and scientists talk together productively, and sometimes they seem to fail to communicate.
Do scientists have to learn philosophy?
I think that scientists can benefit from learning philosophy because it can help them to frame questions and analyze questions and ask questions.
And they have these degrees, right? They're doctors of philosophy, right?
That's right. Because long ago, it used to be that actually everyone was a philosopher, or at least scientists and philosophers were really engaged in the same project.
But there was some kind of cleavage on Earth where the two separated?
Yes, well, I think the big cleavage came when empirical methods, in other words, looking at data, became a central part of what we now call science. And philosophy, while it doesn't ignore data, focuses more on the theoretical.
So the scientists are sort of picking apart whether something is apparent or not.
Sometimes, yeah. And I think in a very broad sense, the methods are very similar. We use a lot of inference to the best explanation in both areas, but maybe many scientists anyway will take the data first or weight the data very heavily and then draw conclusions from that, where philosophers tend to think about a lot of things at first, and this is very crude, and then look at data to some extent, sometimes we just think about things and think about all kinds of crazy things, right? Because that's what we do. We specialize in thinking.
And you specialize in a very distinct kind of thinking. You think a lot about, what do you think a lot about?
Oh, well, I think a lot about everything. Sometimes
Okay.
that gets difficult, but I think I'm especially interested in um, big decisions. I'm especially interested in the nature of the self and how we experience the world and how the world constructs who we are and how our actions construct who we are.
So you must be getting a lot of raw material to think about right now on Earth.
Yeah, it's kind of a crazy time. And one of the things I'm most interested in is like how we understand and respond to really different, new, radical, crazy things. And we're in the middle of a pandemic. And for pretty much everyone, maybe not quite everyone, but just about everyone, this is a really new kind of experience.
And so what have you seen? What are the conclusions that you're coming to?
Well, so for me, what's been, because I think about these things, there's a way in which it's not surprising that we flail around like we've been flailing around when we're faced with a kind of radically new experience. Yeah, exactly. Flail. It's like we don't know what's happening. Sort of bounce back and forth between different options. There's a lot of real uncertainty and fear, and also people kind of point fingers a lot when there are a lot of mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm kind of interested in this in very abstractly because I don't think it's the only sort of situation where we do this, but it's interesting to kind of live through it. You can talk about something in a very theoretical way, but then to live through the kind of radical uncertainty and unknowability that this pandemic is bringing to us and see how it's changing me and the people around me, that's very interesting. Like all of a sudden, I feel like a scientist, right? Like I'm actually like looking at the world and seeing something in action that might even fit my theories.
And are you able to advise some,
Best practices?
Sure, decision makers, big scale decision makers, or even just the people around you?
Yeah, I mean, I try to be careful about that. I try not to go around telling people what to do or even advising them what to do.
It's a lot of responsibility.
Yeah, it's a lot of responsibility, and I like to think about things a lot, but I always feel that there's a lot of room for disagreement and debate. But what I am able to say is, for example, this is a good case where we need to separate out responsibility from praise and blame. So, and the distinction here is like that someone might be responsible for something that they do, but we might not automatically praise or blame them for what they're responsible for in certain conditions, in particular if they were in a situation where they couldn't have known otherwise, right? So you can do the best you can in a pandemic, but if you're not given enough information to know what's kind of coming down the pike, you're still responsible for your actions, but we might not blame you as much as we would otherwise if you make a mistake. We might not praise you as much if you kind of happen to get lucky and do the right thing.
So specifically, are you sort of referring to policymakers or people choosing not to wear a mask or?
I wasn't referring to those sorts of examples because let me think about this. Well, okay.
Maybe I should ask who you're referring to specifically.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
I was thinking more of just kind of you were asking about like individuals in my life or and the choices that people are making. And I guess I think that people should listen to, for example, to the extent that there's science supporting the use of masks, then we should listen to that science and we should be wearing masks. And I think policymakers deserve responsibility and praise or blame for not recognizing how to manage a situation that involves a lot of uncertainty, for not listening to the science, because I think there's some of that, and for not being upfront about things. But I don't think we can blame policymakers for attempting to make projections forward based on the best evidence they have at the time, if there was something that they couldn't possibly know. So, for example, for a long time, we just didn't have any information on COVID-19. And so we didn't know how to treat people. We still don't know that much about how to treat people, but we have more information now. So at the beginning of the pandemic, I think that people made mistakes that were due to just not knowing what they were faced with. And that's a case where I think we need to separate responsibility for their actions from praise or blame, because this was an unknown quantity.
But there's
doctors or policymakers.
I think I think if it's a case where people are trying to do the best they can, and there's no information available, and so they have to kind of effectively make a guess or project forward based on almost nothing, then we should allow some leeway. It's when people don't attend to what we seem to know, or don't attend to the information that we have, that we want to add praise or blame.
Isn't it interesting that people seem to assign this godlike ability to these professionals or to their policymakers, or humans seem to expect, it's like they really see these authorities as supernatural in their abilities almost.
But I will say that there's an interesting split here, because when, especially in cases of when we're looking at medicine or other sorts of biological processes that we think we have a lot of information about, then if we think we have a lot of information about it, then we do ascribe this kind of godlike status to the people that are making these decisions, as though like they know all the information maybe that we don't, and so we could just put our trust in them.
Mm-hmm.
We could talk about that, about whether that's a good idea. But I think what happens is that this attitude is kind of carried over to a new situation where we don't have the information. And as a kind of population, we're not used to not having information. I mean, I like to think of it as sort of on a par with radical new technological developments. So, for example, the time before the internet existed, right? There was a lot we just didn't know about what it would be like to have something like the internet, or maybe even like what it would be like to have smartphones. Or now, think about the possibility of the rise of the machines. At least on Earth, this is kind of a big deal. I don't know what you guys have to deal with, but there's a lot of fear and uncertainty around the idea that we might be able to build machines that think better than people do, and that these machines might control us in some way, or might not behave in ways that we can that we want to sanction. And I think that's absolutely right, and that we should be afraid of those possibilities. But there's a lot of stuff that we just don't know, and the pandemic is a bit like that. Like it's just there's an open future there with radical unknowns.
Well, if it makes you feel any better, we still got animals sitting on this machine out here in space. So
it's a pretty smart machine, but we still need creatures to power it. So what's interesting? Yeah, exactly. And I think that humans probably are on that track too, where you need the machines, but the machines still kind of need you. But what I'm thinking is that this is a transformative experience where it's difficult to make a rational decision because there's no one that's been on the other side of it. Whereas normally you talk about these transformative experiences where somebody's come through and you can look at somebody's experiences, and obviously their experiences won't be yours, but you can approximate something. But here, it's basically this sort of choice of, it's almost a moral choice, it seems like, that people are making about the mask wearing or the not mask wearing, or the economic closures or the not economic closures. What's the framework for making rational decisions here?
Well, I am worried about exactly that. Like, what is the framework for making rational decisions? And one of the problems that we need to think about are, what kind of decision are we making, and what information do we have to make the decision? If there's something that we really can't know about, then we need to frame the decision with that in mind. What can happen is people want to pretend like they know more than they do, or they hope that they know more than they do, or fail to recognize when they can't assign values to future circumstances in a suitably accurate way. And then I think because you want to be able to make a decision and you want to use a model, using the wrong model isn't going to get you where you want to go, even if it makes you feel better. So we got to use the right model. Sometimes we don't have a model. Now, the moral thing, it's an interesting issue. I mean, some of the reasons behind this might be just because here on Earth, we seem to build politics into everything that we're doing. So there might be political issues here that maybe shouldn't have anything to do with mask wearing or policymaking, but have somehow become suffused into these issues. And that might be one reason why it's become a moral issue. But it might be a kind of response too. Like, people don't respond well to unknown futures. They don't respond well to radical uncertainty, right? When I say radical uncertainty, I don't mean the kind of like, I don't know when I walk outside today, I don't know if the sun will be shining or if it'll be cloudy, but I pretty much know it'll be something like that. Like,
the sun will rise.
Yeah, exactly. But I also know that I know that the day could be it's a fall day. It could be reasonably cool. It could be sunny. It could be cloudy. Whatever. But I don't think the sky is going to be orange, or that I'll step out into your world or something like that. Like, I don't have that kind of unknowability. I just have a kind of mere uncertainty, not radical uncertainty. That kind of radical uncertainty is really scary. And when it's scary like that, sometimes people try to make themselves feel better by reducing the uncertainty, by changing the case. Let's make it a moral decision, because at least I can assess this on moral grounds, right? And choose based on some kind of moral assessment that I make. And then I feel like I've got control of the situation.
I think the control issue is really interesting, that humans need to feel like they're in control of situations at all times. Like, if you know nothing about this experience that you're about to undergo, who do you turn to trust? And there seems like there's a lot of distrust, at least in your country right now.
Mm-hmm.
And perhaps it's been politically weaponized, but in general, people are having a hard time. There's authorities and scientists and doctors saying contradicting things. There's contradicting advice.
And it's not contradicting evidence about some experience that they're having, right? Because you talk about this thing of, okay, so maybe you want to have children, and you go and you poll your friends and you figure out if you're going to have kids or not, and they've had this experience, then they can tell you. Mm-hmm. But these are things that are being told with absolutely no context.
Right. So let me actually compare these two. There's some interesting differences and samenesses here, right? Mm-hmm. And so the issue about trust when you're thinking about having a child, one of the things I'm really interested in there is when you go and you ask your friends or your family members about what to do, and they tell you what they think you should do, and maybe they're even right about it, right? There's still an interesting trust issue. And that trust issue partly stems from the way that having a child could change you. Because what you're doing, if you're listening to their advice, is you're trusting that they know how you should change in a certain kind of way. And I think there are really interesting questions there, because that kind of change could just be a change that's something that you already want. You just don't recognize it in yourself. But it could be that the kind of change they're advocating for really means like just changing who you are. Those are two different ways in which you might have to trust these people. And I think that it's important to tease those two apart and to think about the different kinds of trust involved, and to know clearly what we want to do and why we want to do it. On the side of policymakers with respect to COVID, I think the lack of trust partly comes from not feeling like we're getting the information that we need, so not being able to trust the testimony that we're getting, or we're getting conflicting testimony. So in the first case, I just said, well, assume that the testimony in some sense is reliable, like you really will be happy, let's say, with your decision to have a child. The real question is, like, what's the mechanism underneath that's going to make you happy and for that? And do you trust these people to know that that mechanism is the right one for you? But with COVID, because we don't even think that people have the right answers, or maybe the answers they're giving us are influenced by things other than the science, then we're not trusting them to tell us what the real values are for various outcomes. And so we're not able to kind of build, or trust them to kind of build a decision model for us.
So what can people do to start making sense of conflicting opinions like that?
What can they do? Well, I think that's a real problem. I'm not sure there is anything that they can do. I mean, they can, if the issue is that policymakers and various authority figures are giving us information that we think is not trustworthy or is faulty in some way, well, then the thing to do is to try to replace those authority figures or those political figures, for sure. But I can't really think of anything more effective than that, aside from, again, recognizing what's happening and trying not to let the fear of the unknown kind of dominate the way that you're living your life and experiencing your world. That's a kind of personal thing that's actually really important.
A collapse of trust in the public authority figures and in one another seems like it would precipitate an increase in fear. And so humans seem like they're particularly untrustworthy right now, maybe because they spend a lot of time paying attention to people that they don't actually know in real life. They're watching a lot of screens, they're seeing these people that are somewhere far away from them, they have no idea who they are really, and so nothing really seems real because everybody's locked away in their houses and not really encountering anybody else.
That's really interesting. And that, right, so there's testimony that you can get from authority figures, and then there's testimony you can get from friends and family. And just going back to the parenting case, right? Like, I think people are more inclined to trust the advice from their friends and family members than they are from, just some kind of authority figure telling them, well, you'll be happier. The research tells us that you'll be happier if you have a child, or maybe the research tells us that you won't be happier if you have a child. And maybe that research is actually extremely well done and highly accurate. And yet, because you don't have close ties, right, to those individuals, you might not be as comfortable accepting that advice and not able to trust that testimony.
And people are very fractured with each other right now on Earth, more than they have been in the past, maybe. Where perhaps you used to have a relationship with your doctor, where you always had the same doctor who was able to tell you what was happening and you trusted their advice. But there's a growth. And
the doctors might have agreed. Perhaps there was central media channels, central distribution of information.
There was less alternative perspective. You couldn't turn on, a television with infinite channels where you would find infinite number of people giving you an infinite number of perspectives. And they're presented in this such an effective way. We page through your YouTube, and my God, these people are... they're more talented than the studios that were around in the, middle of the 20th century. So these messages are packaged so effectively to confuse and to lead people along a different path. And it seems like there's a lot of people on Earth who have basically chosen to make this transformative experience of defecting from the group.
Yes. Yes. And so there are real issues here about how you decide who to listen to. Right?
Yeah.
And I worry that, again, when faced with radical uncertainty and people get afraid, then the way that they interpret testimony can become biased, because testimony that somehow appeals to some of their more emotional feelings can get more of a foothold than testimony that doesn't. That's just the way, there's this interesting way in which human emotions affect the way that we think. And sometimes that can be okay, but I think sometimes it can bias us in disturbing ways.
Well, one thing that's fascinating that we found is that it seems like scientists that really have a grip on a subject express their theories with very carefully scaled certainty. I've even heard it said by some wise earthlings that the more certainty a scientist has, probably the less likely their theory is to hold water. And so...
It seems like there's a surplus of certainty on Earth right now, where the information that's given through most channels is given with this this is the truth, this is fact.
High certainty, high production value.
Right. So just going back to, like, if we are afraid of uncertainty and we find we're uncomfortable with uncertainty and we want to sort of stay away from uncertainty because certainty seems like it makes us more comfortable, gives us a good gut feeling, makes us feel secure, makes us feel like we can make decisions in rational ways. And there's a way in which, of course, if we really do have certainty, then maybe we do have the information. But if it's more the presence, the appearance of certainty, when you don't actually have that certainty, right? That's a problem. So the scientist who honestly presents the information that he or she has, and then points out that it's not certain, that there's a level of uncertainty to it, that's an argument for trusting that testimony.
Mm-hmm.
And it should lead then to a better, if that's right, it should lead to a better decision model. But our gut feeling is to stay away from that kind of uncertainty and then to kind of run more towards ideas that are presented with more certainty, especially ones that appeal to other emotions that we have.
What do you think accounts for that?
Or what can be done?
Well, so human psychology is a beautiful but also disturbing thing, right? I mean, and there's the more certainty we have ordinarily, right, the harder it is to make mistakes, right? The more uncertain things are, the easier it is to make mistakes. And in a dangerous environment, a mistake can be very costly, right? So we feel safer in contexts where we think we have certainty. And what can be done about it? I don't know. Well, that's one reason why I like philosophy, because philosophers think about these things and try to step back and understand them. Maybe because the first step is to understand that we can feel uncomfortable when we're faced with uncertainty, not because we're not getting the truth, but just because uncertainty is uncomfortable.
Mm.
Diagnosing the source of what we're worried about is really important.
It seems to me like philosophers on Earth are often concerned with making sure that we're asking the right question or that we're looking at a phenomena through the right lens.
Yes, that's right. So that's what I was saying at the very start. Like, our job is to try to, as best we can, think about things and frame a problem or ask questions or analyze them. And to the extent that we're successful in philosophy, we're able to ask certain kinds of questions that might be useful down the line.
It's interesting that you say that uncertainty is a bad thing, because it seems like, from a biological perspective on Earth, making mistakes and this sort of uncertainty is actually what drives evolution. It's what drives the creation of new species. It's what drives adaptation. If you look even more recently, because I don't think that humans are evolving too much right now that you can actually, look at. Mm-hmm. But if you look at the uncertainty of something like the expansion of people into the frontier in the United States, mm-hmm. highly uncertain environment, but viewed as being something quite good for the psyche of the people.
I think there's a level of that there's a trade-off between certainty and uncertainty, and the safety or the relative danger of the environment. So expanding to the frontier, actually, that is quite a dangerous environment. But if you do it, I think if it was done at least reasonably slowly to try to allow for a certain amount of uncertainty, but not too much, then you can have a kind of productive outcome. It's always risky, right? Like, I mean, there's a trade-off between basically risk and the value of exploration.
And you're kind of focused on the situations where you can't really easily evaluate the reward in this risk-reward situation. Right. So you're probably, I hope you're not too tired of talking about this vampire situation that you bring up, but I was wondering, I was thinking about this a little bit, and what would it look like if you asked the question, I'm already a vampire, I have a choice to stop being a vampire? Would that be a more or less difficult decision to make, or would the same sort of impossibility apply to it?
Interesting. Right. So my favorite case is if is when a human is confronted by Dracula or a vampire and has the choice, right, the irreversible choice of whether or not to become a vampire. But the problem is that you have to you have to be a vampire to know what it's like to be a vampire. So how are you going to choose? And you're asking me, well, look, what about the vampires? Like, what if the vampire had the choice?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, this really seems to matter because, at least on our planet, when we were working out our ecological relationship, it was very difficult to convince a lot of the other intelligent beings that it was important for them to stop destroying their environment.
Mm-hmm.
And so it really was a reverse vampire situation. And
because they didn't necessarily want to change. They didn't want to stop being vampires, but it was kind of necessary.
Right. Yeah, I think it would be transformative. I think, or at least potentially so, unless the vampire had previously been human and was able somehow to remember about that.
But as far as I can understand from what you say about transformative experience is that the rational choice that one makes is the choice to change.
Well, so that's right. So what I want to say is, in a case where you have to make a transformative choice, and you don't know the nature of the life that you're choosing. Maybe you have some information from other people, but there's a way in which you can't like imaginatively understand what your new life would be like. Then the choice comes down to choosing whether or not to make that discovery. So you choose, do I want to find out what it's like to be a vampire? Or if you're a vampire, you choose, let's say you were never human or you can't remember it. Do I want to find out what it's like to be human?
So then
it's a big deal.
Yeah, it seems like if you could find a way to encourage humans to embrace uncertainty, then the whole thing would simplify suddenly.
Yes, I think, and let's distinguish again between uncertainty where there's a lot that's just not, you're unsure about what's going to happen, but you still know what all the options are, and then where you just really don't know what's going to happen. And I think I think we're uncomfortable with both kinds of uncertainty, and we're especially concerned with that latter kind of uncertainty. You just don't know what's going to happen in a really basic way.
But that comes down maybe to the fact that humans need their jobs to be able to make money, to be able to keep their house, to be able to stay warm. So if there was some mechanism by which you could say, well, you'll keep your job, you'll be able to support your family, you'll still have your infinite channel television, and perhaps people would be less uncomfortable with uncertainty in that case because it's not a life or death risk.
Right. So you establish some certainty around maybe some of the parameters, and then there's still this giant uncertainty or unknown thing. But as long as some of the other features of the life that you value can be kept in place, then that allows you to take a risk along one dimension of what you're doing. It's still hugely risky because you can undergo a change and then maybe you don't care about keeping that job anymore. Or, you don't care about those things, right? And that's part of the risk.
So was your argument that it was essentially impossible to make a rational decision when you're facing a transformative experience?
No, I would argue that first part of what I was arguing for was what I've been describing now about knowing what you don't know. And I think of it as a kind of epistemic humility, where the epistemic involves knowledge. So the thought is, don't expect people to make decisions in some of these high stakes cases in a way that expects them to know what they're getting themselves into. Right? And then, so recognize when we're faced with these decisions that there really is a lot that we can't know. And then in virtue of that, change the way that you're constructing the problem so that you recognize that you're choosing to make a discovery or that you're choosing to take a particular kind of risk and make it on that basis. You might want to avoid the risk. I mean, maybe you don't want to risk losing your job and the rest of, and what you care, all these other things that you care about, or maybe you just don't want to risk losing the life that you lead now. Or maybe you are willing to take that risk and discover a whole new life that could be great or could be not so great, and could change how much you care about the things that you care about now. And I think your appetite for risk and your hopes about the way it would be for you to live your life are going to play a role in whether you choose to transform or not.
Now, do you think these principles could be applied to rhetoricians or folks on the other side, those that say really wanted to recruit you to have children, or the vampires that really wanted to recruit you to be a vampire? Are there principles from your examinations that could be harnessed by those individuals to make their case more persuasive?
Well, I think so, because a part of my view is that when we're on one side of the experience, we haven't been on both sides, then there's a way in which we really can't judge something important about that unknown experience. And I think that we need to recognize again that maybe we can't make those judgments. So I talk about people who are very different from ourselves, or I talk about the possibility of radical cognitive change, or physical disability, or cognitive disability, or new kinds of physical or cognitive abilities, which is really, I think, what often disability amounts to. And it's very hard for us not to judge in these kinds of cases, to say, well, one way of being is better than another. But I think we're often wrong in those judgments, that we don't have the information we need to make those judgments. And so by leaving space for that, then I'm leaving space for the vampire to say, you should try this new experience because you have principled reasons for not being able to reject it as bad.
So there's almost a moral imperative to push back a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's an epistemic imperative, right? Because I try to stick, because I feel like I'm mostly interested in cases where, morality isn't really guiding us. So where it's kind of permissible to do one thing or the other. I think if you really feel strongly that there's a moral answer here, or let's put it this way, if there really is a moral answer there, then we should follow that. We may not be able to know what the right moral answer is.
It's interesting. So are there things that are outside of morality like that? Are there really decisions that one can make that have nothing to do with morality?
Well, the humans have different definitions for morality, remember?
I suppose.
Well, I would say...
Yeah, what's the human definition for morality?
Oh, well, that. I mean, you might say, I'm not qualified to answer that question. But I will say that the space of questions I'm thinking about involves, so just going back to the case of whether you want to become a parent, I think it's not that it's a completely amoral decision. It's just that I think that it's morally permissible to choose one way or the other in many contexts, right? And I like to think of the vampire case where it's morally permissible to choose one way or the other, because of course, right, modern vampires are going to drink artificial blood or something.
Well, so in that case, it seems like it's a moral choice to become the vampire, because if you're drinking artificial blood, that means that you're not eating animals that are being raised in a factory setting. And so suddenly the choice of becoming a vampire becomes a more moral choice. And you can choose not to make that moral choice.
I think that's true, but I think that there's so many other, I mean, these are the kinds of cases where you have to look at all the nitty-gritty details, and so we could probably spell them out to try to figure it out. But it might be that leaving the society of humans means you also then leave responsibilities that you have as a human, or you care less about them and you care more about vampire society. And there's a question there about whether that would be morally permissible. So I think what I'm trying to say is that there's always a very complicated moral calculus that we have to explore. And my hope is that within the space of possibilities, there are a number of different, there are at least a few different options that we can choose, and it's permissible to choose between them, given the kind of overall balance of moral reasons.
Do you think that morality is subject to this rational decision making?
It's sort of fashionable in philosophy to think that rationality and morality are necessarily or deeply connected, and I don't really feel that way at all. Seems to me that they're separate. I don't understand why we have to think of them as so tightly connected.
What is the argument for their tight connection?
I think it's, to the extent that I can channel this view, the thought is that the kind of ideally rational individual is somehow also ideally moral. And so rationality, like the rational choice kind of coincides with the kind of morally best choice.
That's fascinating because I feel like the ultimately rational... So on Alpha Floss, our definition for morality is consent. So an immoral action is one that violates consent. And a fully, totally rational decision-making process seems like it's highly likely to violate consent. Because you can come up with all kinds of crazy rational explanations for, let's say, I think the Nazi platform during World War II. Right? There's a rational explanation there, given on an economic basis, for why it was necessary to commit genocide.
Or Darwinoid.
Or Darwinoid, exactly. You have rational explanations that come with deep mechanism that serve to violate the consent of others. There's something strange about that, where they do seem to be disconnected. But it's interesting that you say that you're not totally qualified to answer the question of what morality means for humans. Isn't this something that all of you have to be carrying around?
All of us humans?
Yeah.
Well, I think one can have a moral code and carry around a moral code, maybe not a fully formed one. But the philosophical question about the relationship between rationality and morality, and even what morality is one that I think is explored by ethicists, philosophers who focus on ethics or meta-ethics. And I'm just a metaphysician, so it's, above my pay grade.
Do you have ethicist friends?
I do.
They come by for a metaphysical checkup once every year or so?
Every once in a while, I hang out with my ethicist friends, and one of my best ethicist friends is Nomi Arpali at Brown University. And yes, she and I have discussions, and if I'm lucky, she'll even sing a song about the various philosophical views.
Wow.
Yeah, the ethicists are pretty cool.
It's interesting. It seems like philosophy on Earth appeared in song format first.
I didn't know that.
These big epic poem type pieces.
Philosophy is this interesting field that, it's technically part of the humanities, but it often doesn't fit with the other humanities. There's a little bit of art and a little bit of science and a little bit of everything, really, that we do. And sometimes some of the things that we're trying to get at and explore are hard to explore using ordinary language, precise language. And so sometimes other kinds of expression can get at some of these ideas.
I wonder if the loss of some of that beauty in language doesn't have to do with the inability of really dull science to hold people's attention, and for a lot of distrust to appear because the alternatives are so tasty compared to it.
That's interesting.
Well, truth can be hard work, right? And
truth is also hard to get at through the sciences, because there's perhaps a what do they call it? Intrasubjective perspectives?
Dr. Canary?
Yeah, Dr. Canary. We talked to an evolutionary psychologist who talked about the way of getting at truth had a lot to do with intersubjective perspectives, and that science was sorely lacking in those. if only because it offers only a human perspective, and at that, a limited human perspective.
Hmm.
So it seems like the way to get at truth on Earth would kind of require consulting the animals.
Ooh,
Because
I
how
like
can you
that.
possibly come to truth if it's just you guys?
Right. Well, the hope is
Hmm.
that we can use principles of inference to at least get closer to the truth.
Mm.
And I do think that consulting other sources is going to help us maybe with our inferences. But I'm not totally skeptical about the possibility of finding at least some truth, even just by human means.
And what does truth mean? It's just the end? It's the end of the road? Is it something that can't be moved?
Is that an important word in philosophy?
It's a very important word in philosophy. I would distinguish between truth and belief. So belief and knowledge are mental, involve mental states, and they concern how we think about the world and how we can represent the world. Whereas truth involves like just the way the world is.
Hmm.
It's
And so a lot of,
it's objective?
I would say yes. There can be our perceptions of the truth, which could be mind dependent, but the way I think about truth is just the way the world is.
So
Reality
it's
is
like a movie.
Like of how
how's it
things
like a
happen?
movie?
Well, I'm just trying to relate. Like, so how we think about science on Alva Floss is that we have theories that kind of reconstruct a movie that we're not able to watch. So you have some event like evolution, for instance, is a theory on Earth. And it's trying to explain the appearance of all these varieties and monotonies of form of animals. And you don't really have the full movie of what happened in the past, but you do have a few frames of the movie. So you try to construct a theory to fill in the blanks.
Oh, see, I would say maybe there's just a difference between this is a difference between your world and mine. I would say that the world is what the movie's about,
Yeah.
and the movie like is like the theory. And so like you can look at it's like it's a representation of the world, right?
Mm.
So when you watch the movie, it's telling you about what the camera is showing you.
Right. Yeah. And in that case, there could be different movies. There could be different theories.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
But the truth, I guess, in my analogy, the truth is this movie that is sort of the universal perspective. It's the universal movie. It's the record of what actually happened.
Mm-hmm.
But I see what you're saying.
But I think about this from the standpoint of, let's say you have a hyper-intelligent ant. And the ant is very intelligent. He's got a laboratory. There's equipment for being able to study things and deep in the hive, and they're looking at the world and they're trying to reconstruct it. But can the ants ever conceive of what a forest is? Can an ant ever conceive of the idea of the planet? Especially because it's just such a size scale difference.
Right. No, it doesn't. The idea that truth concerns the way the world is doesn't mean that we can know the whole truth. Maybe we can't know everything. Maybe the ant can study the part of the world that the quite brilliant ant
Very brilliant ant.
can know. But it might just be a very small portion.
It's a very small microscope, it's limited.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But I would still say that given the part of the world of reality that the ant can study, the ant can know the truth about that part of the world.
But the parts that aren't true are also perhaps important too, right? The hypotheticals. So you might not know, especially in science, you don't always know how things work, and you have to put in these placeholders. So truth might not be the end all be all in a practical sense.
Well, because you're filling pieces in as you go.
Yeah. Well,
that's right. I mean, I think so. Sometimes we're in a situation where we think we have a lot of beliefs that we think are true,
Mm.
but then there's a lot of stuff that we think, well, we don't know. And we think maybe there's truth out there, but we're still trying to discover it. And
Mm.
the responsible thing is then to have a bunch of hypotheses and maybe even hypothetical claims. Well, if this part of the world is the way we think it is, well, then we can infer this other thing.
Yeah.
And that's the responsible way.
And when you have two people that disagree about that assumption, though, things start to get really haywire. Like if you come back to this idea of the pandemic on Earth, and you start with, if this is how the world is, you have two people that will never be able to get past the starting gate of, if this is how the world is.
Maybe you have to push it back. So maybe you have to say, well, okay, we can't agree on our initial premise. So then we have to step back and keep going back until we can find premises on which we agree, and then go carefully up to see if we can get to it, the original starting point. If you can never do that, that is a serious problem. And sometimes we can never do that.
Do you think that's happening on Earth right now?
I do think it does happen, in particular when people have very different political and moral beliefs. And it may be in part because the political and moral beliefs are really at the very beginning of the series of inferences and decisions and conclusions that people are drawing. And because those are so far separated.
Do you think you can back it up before those even?
Yeah, like can you apply the same method to values and morals?
Can you get before those?
Pre-values, pre-morals. Where do you start with?
I think you can ask questions about which morals are the right ones and which values are the right ones, for sure. I was thinking that some of the differences, though, concern maybe not which values are the right ones, because maybe people can agree on that, but on questions of fact, because some of the political differences in particular seem to involve, differences in what the basic facts are. Going back to the trust question that we were talking about before.
Well, this is the starting assumptions, right? Of what does the world actually look like? And people can't seem to agree on the starting principles for that, really.
I'm not sure people even agree on methodologically what we're supposed to use to try to determine what the world is really like.
What are the options there?
Well, I'm a fan, again, of both science and philosophy, and trying to reason using logic. But I think some people are not as impressed by science, or at least they're not as impressed by scientists. And so they don't, they're, again, going back to trust issues, like someone who thinks that, I don't know, vaccines cause autism or something, that person doesn't trust some of the various scientists that have testified to the idea that there is no link between vaccines and autism. And that's a problem. There's a problem if people are not trusting scientific authorities for that information.
What's interesting is they trust their scientists.
Yes, well, that's right. So then we push back to, well, trust the science. And then there's a difference in what counts as science or what counts as, the scientific facts. So.
And you can point to exactly where that cleavage happens, because the alternative science of, let's say, vaccines or whatever, hasn't been through the same rigorous testing framework as the science that agrees with the fact that vaccines are good. But you can point to the fact that that's an expensive testing framework, and there's a conspiracy to keep these things out, because if you allowed them to come through, then they would upend the entire moneyed organization of the pharmaceutical companies. And so you have these really, really deeply constructed, I would almost say, arguments of a parallel rationality. These are not necessarily irrational claims.
No, so here's what I would say. There's the method, in some sense, might be the same. Take a set of premises that you think are justified, and infer that they're true, and then from those premises you infer a conclusion, right? And so the question is whether or not. So the method, in some sense, on both sides is the same, but where the argument comes in is which set of premises to trust.
Exactly, and this is what comes down to this moral and values fracture.
Yes, that's right.
And so how can you heal that fracture on Earth? This seems like what philosophy would be really good for is finding ways for people to have conversations
with people they disagree with. You must deal with people who disagree with you all day long.
And people you disagree with.
That's my job.
Yeah, exactly.
If people didn't disagree with me, I would be boring. That's what people don't realize about philosophy is that, you can think about it this way. So we were talking about truth and belief and rational inference, but there's also wisdom, right? And a way of thinking about wisdom is of thinking about different ways of understanding the world and different, you might say, models for the way that we think the world is, and choosing between good ones and bad ones, and being able to recognize the merits and demerits of different models, being able to think about different possibilities. That's a kind of wisdom. And what philosophers try to do is to teach people how to do that in order to kind of increase the level of wisdom. And the hope would be that then would allow people to choose between, say, these different sets of premises in a way that gets closer to the truth, to improve their reasoning processes.
Do you think these philosophical principles can be brought to a younger audience or a wider audience?
Yeah, is this something that kids on Earth are learning?
I think so. I am not involved in this, but there are people who encourage the teaching of philosophy, for example, at the high school level or even at the middle school level. And again, with philosophy, it's a practice that you engage in, and so you can study something in philosophy that might seem like very abstract and maybe not related to ordinary concerns, but the point is that you perform this act because it teaches you how to use your brain in a certain way. It teaches you how to build these models and evaluate hypotheticals and follow lines of thought to their conclusions in a careful way, and to see different angles. And it's that ability. It's a bit like training for a sport, right? It's like that ability is what I think could be taught much earlier in the classroom.
Yeah. We are about to launch an investigation into the education system, the public education system. So I will be sure to speak with our experts about that later.
We'll find out. Yeah, exactly.
Thanks.
We'll need it. Well, I think that we've taken a lot of your time, Dr. Paul.
Thank you for inviting me to talk with you. I'm very interested in your world, actually. It sounds like it's quite different from mine.
Do you have questions for us? We've asked you a lot of questions. It's only fair that you get a couple.
Just really, my only question is like, do you recognize this guy?
Oh my goodness.
Like,
He looks like he sees really well.
Yeah. He's the only alien I've ever met before I met you, and I was just wondering if you guys were related.
No, where's he from? Do you know?
I think he's a Martian.
Oh, we haven't made it to Mars in a while. Things have been changing there a lot.
Mars has dried up lately.
Yeah, maybe he's underground.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Okay.
That'd be pretty cool.
We'll dig down when we stop by and see if we can find him.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Well, good luck with your studies. We're really curious what happens and what you learn in the coming year.
You said that you were working on something right now. What is that?
Oh, I'm working on a book about transformative experience. And it's a book for non-philosophers. So for people who want to read more about what these experiences are and think about how they affect the way we build ourselves and change ourselves and take our lives forward.
I know that we said that we've taken a lot of your time, but I just realized that I had a different question.
Okay.
The transformative experience is a shift in value structure.
Mm-hmm.
So if there is a starting point where the moral and value structures of two people don't agree, then it seems like if you send them on a transformative experience, then perhaps that's how you influence that starting point of the conversation.
Oh, that's very interesting. Right. So take two people who are very, very different, have a different maybe moral or value code. Both of them become parents, or both of them fight in a war, or live through a pandemic, or undergo some other kind of transformative experience. That means they may have values in common after that through the experience that sort of restructured them in some ways. Yeah.
That's something to think about.
Shared experience can teach people a lot.
Well, I'll be curious how this shared experience of meeting someone from another world changes both of us.
Indeed.
It's great to meet you guys.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much, Dr. Paul.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.